The first sign of the invasion came not as an explosion or a burst of gunfire, but in the eerie silence that followed the blackout. Entire cities across the globe fell into darkness as power grids were shut down, communications were severed, and a strange, unsettling hum filled the air. People looked up, expecting the typical threat of an alien spacecraft or military attack. Instead, they saw nothing, only the same starry sky they had always known. But something was wrong. In New York, chaos spread like wildfire. People stumbled out of their homes, shouting at each other, their faces a mix of confusion and terror. The streets were littered with broken cars and abandoned belongings, as if everyone had suddenly been struck by an overwhelming fear. News outlets tried to piece together what was happening, but all broadcasts were scrambled, replaced by a constant, low-frequency static that felt suffocating. It wasn't long before the real threat revealed itself, a new kind of invasion, silent, methodical, and far more terrifying than anything humanity had ever faced. The Vorith, an alien species with a ruthless reputation, had arrived. But they didn't need to fire a single shot to bring the planet to its knees. They had mastered the art of manipulation, and their technology could seize control of any human mind with a mere whisper. By the time the first resistance groups emerged, the Vorith had already begun their insidious work. Their presence was everywhere, but always unseen. It was as though they had infiltrated every facet of society: government officials, military leaders, ordinary citizens. Everyone was affected. People who had been friendly one moment were suddenly turned into mindless drones the next, following orders with a chilling obedience. Whole towns vanished without a trace, their inhabitants lost to the Vorith's control. Captain Alina Voss, once a decorated soldier and now a leader of a covert resistance group, watched the events unfold from a hidden underground facility. She had spent years preparing for this moment, training with a select few military operatives and scientists who had been investigating strange, unexplained signals in deep space. Alina was no stranger to war, but this was different. This wasn't just an enemy to be defeated. This was an enemy that understood how to break people from within. At first, it seemed as though the Vorith had the world in their grasp. Governments had already fallen, and the global economy was crumbling. Fear spread like a disease, infecting every city and corner of the planet. Resistance was fragmented and ill-prepared, and the Vorith knew it. Alina's team, however, had spent years quietly building a network to fight back, to defy the invaders even when the world seemed lost. They knew the truth. The Vorith were not just here to conquer. They were here to break humanity's spirit, to make Earth surrender without a fight. Alina looked out from the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. Her team was small, but it was all they had. It was time to strike. She gave the signal, and the resistance moved out, knowing that their first task was not to fight an army, but to ignite a spark of defiance in the hearts of the people. The Vorith had underestimated humanity's will to survive. The world had not surrendered, not yet. As the team infiltrated the heart of New York, Alina's mind raced. The true battle had only just begun. The operation in New York was nothing short of a miracle. Alina's resistance group had managed to disable a key Vorith communication relay, sending a wave of disruption through their global network. But it wasn't just the technology that had been damaged. It was the Vorith's sense of invulnerability. For the first time, they realized that humans weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. In the aftermath of the successful strike, the team returned to their underground base, battered but determined. The operation had cost them 2 members, and there were still so many unknowns about the Vorith's true capabilities. Yet, despite the losses, the small victory sent a shockwave through humanity. Across the world, people began to stir. Resistance cells started forming in every major city, though many remained underground, out of sight of the Vorith's ever-watchful eye. Alina couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Vorith were far more cunning than they had anticipated. Their ability to control minds, to subtly manipulate leaders and civilians alike, was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. But Alina knew something they didn't. The Vorith's control wasn't absolute, not yet. There was a way to break it, if they could find the right weapon. The team's scientist, Dr. Ralston, had spent years investigating ancient technologies, searching for anything that could turn the tide. His obsession had started as a wild theory, but was now their only hope. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, hidden in forgotten military bunkers, was a weapon that could neutralize the Vorith's power, a relic from the Cold War, one that had never been used, but one that could change everything. It was a long shot, but Alina had no choice but to trust Ralston's research. The team set off to locate the hidden facility, knowing that every moment they wasted brought the Vorith closer to securing their rule. As they trekked through the desolate landscapes of the former United States, Alina couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. They were racing against time, and with every passing day, humanity's hope slipped further away. When they finally reached the location, buried beneath a mountain range, the facility looked abandoned, a relic of a time long past. But as the team breached its security and descended into the depths of the complex, Alina's heart raced with both dread and anticipation. The Phoenix Project, as Ralston had called it, was a long-forgotten weapon designed to disrupt alien technology, an EMP on a global scale that would render the Vorith's mind control and shields useless. The team worked quickly to power up the dormant system, but as they did, they discovered something that made Alina's blood run cold. The weapon was more than just a tool of defense. It was an instrument of destruction. To activate it would require the sacrifice of an entire city's worth of resources, possibly millions of lives. Alina stared at the glowing holographic map in front of her, knowing that using it could shift the balance of the war, but at a cost that humanity might not be willing to pay. Ralston, his face pale and trembling, urged Alina to make a decision. The weapon was their only hope, but was it worth the lives it would claim? As the team prepared to leave, Alina's mind was filled with doubt. How could they justify such a sacrifice, even if it meant saving the world? She had always believed in the greater good, but this was different. The decision would have to be made soon. There was no time to waste. The Vorith were closing in. As Alina looked out over the ruined landscape, she knew that the human spirit was capable of incredible defiance. But would it be enough to stop the unimaginable force that was coming? The Phoenix Project was humanity's last hope, but it came at a terrible price. As Alina stood over the glowing holographic map, her fingers hovering over the activation sequence, the weight of the decision pressed on her chest like a vice. She knew that deploying the weapon meant condemning millions of innocent lives, but could they afford to wait for the Vorith to finish what they had started? The war was reaching a tipping point. If they didn't act soon, Earth would be lost. In the dead of night, Alina made the call. The Phoenix Project would be activated, but they needed a diversion, a way to buy enough time to deploy the weapon. Alina's team wasn't large, but they had something the Vorith had not anticipated, a network of scattered resistance cells that had quietly grown over the past few months, people from every walk of life united under a single cause: survival. They were far from coordinated, and most lacked the training to fight back effectively, but desperation and a shared hatred of their invaders had turned ordinary citizens into a force to be reckoned with. Across the globe, small victories began to snowball. In Paris, a group of hackers managed to infiltrate a Vorith command center and broadcast a message of defiance to the world. "We are not your slaves," the message read. "We are not defeated. Humanity will rise." The broadcast reached millions. In a remote village in South America, villagers who had once cowered in fear launched an assault on a Vorith supply convoy, ambushing the invaders and seizing their resources. The news of these acts spread like wildfire, igniting the spark of rebellion in places where humanity had almost forgotten how to resist. The Vorith, unaccustomed to the idea of humans fighting back, were thrown into disarray. Their response was swift and brutal. They began deploying their mind-controlled human agents to quell the uprisings, but it only made matters worse. The more the Vorith tried to suppress the resistance, the more it spread. Alina knew the tide was turning, but she also knew that the Vorith were calculating. This was only the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous battle. With the distraction set into motion, Alina and her team moved swiftly to the heart of the Vorith's operations. They had pinpointed a key supply line in the heart of Europe, an underground depot that fed the Vorith's forces across the continent. If they could cripple this supply line, it would stall the Vorith's advance long enough for the Phoenix Project to be activated. The mission was risky. The Vorith were everywhere, their presence almost invisible, but Alina's team had trained for this moment. They infiltrated the depot under the cover of night, moving silently through the darkness, planting explosives and sabotaging the alien technology that powered the facility. The tension in the air was palpable. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement felt dangerous, but they pressed on. As the countdown to detonate the charges began, Alina's heart raced. They had made it this far, but would it be enough? She knew the Vorith were closing in on their position, and any minute now, they could be discovered. But just as the clock neared its final seconds, a sudden explosion rocked the facility. The depot erupted in flames, lighting up the sky like a beacon. Alina's team had done it. They had taken out a critical piece of the Vorith war machine. But the victory was bittersweet. The explosion had triggered an alarm, and the Vorith forces were already on their way. As Alina and her team fought their way out of the facility, they knew this was just the beginning of a much larger war. The world was waking up. The rebellion had been ignited, and no matter what the cost, they would continue to fight. The spark had turned into a fire, and there was no turning back now. In the aftermath of the explosion, the resistance surged. Across continents, people began to rise against the Vorith. Small rebellions turned into organized cells, each one more determined than the last. Alina's message of hope and defiance was being heard loud and clear. Humanity would not be broken. The fight was far from over, but the first real blow had been struck. The Vorith may have underestimated humanity's resilience, but they would soon learn that the spirit of defiance could not be crushed so easily. The victory at the Vorith supply depot had been a hard-won one, but it came with consequences that Alina had not fully anticipated. The explosion had not only crippled a vital part of the alien war machine, but it had also triggered a cascade of retaliatory strikes from the Vorith. What followed was a brutal wave of repression, an unforgiving crackdown on resistance cells across the globe. As soon as the news of the attack spread, the Vorith unleashed their mind-controlled enforcers, humans who had been altered beyond recognition, turned into drones for the alien invaders. These mind-controlled soldiers infiltrated resistance groups with terrifying precision, sowing chaos and mistrust. In cities like London, Tokyo, and Rio de Janeiro, entire underground networks were wiped out in a matter of hours. It wasn't long before Alina's team received word of their first major loss. Mark, Alina's closest friend and second in command, had been captured during an assault on a Vorith facility in Madrid. The mission had been risky from the start, but Mark had insisted on leading it, his voice resolute as ever. They had gone in expecting a straightforward sabotage operation, but the Vorith had been waiting. Mark had been separated from the group in the chaos, and by the time Alina realized what had happened, the Vorith had already turned him into one of their mind-controlled agents. The news hit Alina like a gut punch. Mark was no ordinary soldier. He was the heart of the resistance, the one who had kept morale high even in the darkest hours. And now he was lost, a tool in the hands of the enemy. Alina's guilt was palpable. She had led him into the fire, and now he was on the other side. The decision was made quickly. They had to rescue him, or humanity's moral core would be shattered. Alina knew the Vorith would use him as propaganda to destroy the rebellion's spirit. If they could save him, they could show the world that the human will could not be broken, even under the most insidious of circumstances. But the rescue mission came at a great cost. Alina's team infiltrated the Vorith-controlled facility in an attempt to retrieve Mark, but the mission quickly turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The Vorith had anticipated this move. Mark, now an agent of the Vorith, was used as bait. Alina had no choice but to confront him. The scene that unfolded was a nightmare. Mark stood before her, his eyes hollow, his once familiar face now a cold, unfeeling mask. He spoke in the language of the Vorith, his voice devoid of emotion, urging Alina to join them, to accept their inevitable dominance. He was a ghost of the man he had once been, and the pain of seeing him like this was almost unbearable. Alina fought back the tears, knowing that to show any weakness now would be to lose everything they had fought for. In a moment of clarity, Mark broke through for just a second, his eyes flickering with recognition, but it was too late. The Vorith had full control. In the end, Alina was forced to make the hardest decision of her life. She had to leave him behind. The mission ended in tragedy, with Mark's death at the hands of the Vorith. Alina returned to the Resistance, shattered by the loss. Mark's death was not in vain, however. His sacrifice fueled the fire of humanity's defiance, and the rebellion grew even more determined to continue. Alina knew that the road ahead would only become harder, that the Vorith would not relent, but if anything had been made clear, it was this: victory, no matter how hard won, always comes with a price. The Resistance now had one goal in mind: to end this war, once and for all. The Phoenix Project was humanity's only remaining hope, but Alina knew the cost of activating it would be greater than any of them had anticipated. The sacrifices were mounting, and soon there would be nothing left but the war itself. Yet, there was no turning back. For humanity to survive, the price of victory had already been set. The loss of Mark had left an indelible scar on Alina's soul, but the Resistance was still moving forward. The Vorith, however, had not stopped, and their relentless pressure on the human spirit continued. Alina found herself more and more isolated, the weight of leadership pressing down on her with every passing day. She had become a symbol of humanity's defiance, but it came at a steep cost. The Resistance's forces were fragmented, resources dwindling, and trust, once a pillar of their unity, was beginning to fray. There was a nagging suspicion in the back of Alina's mind, something that didn't sit right. The Vorith had become increasingly aware of the Resistance's movements, and somehow, despite their best efforts to keep everything under wraps, the enemy seemed to know their every step. It was as if they were always one move ahead. One evening, as Alina and her closest allies gathered in their underground base to plan their next move, one of their own, a lieutenant named Ivan, approached her with an urgent report. He was calm, but there was something in his eyes that Alina couldn't quite place. He spoke of a possible traitor within their ranks, someone feeding information to the Vorith. Alina's heart sank. The thought of a mole inside their ranks was almost too much to bear. Ivan had always been loyal, but this time his eyes were different, tense, guarded, almost too rehearsed. Alina listened to his concerns, but a voice inside her mind screamed that something was off. He provided enough details to make it seem credible, even urgent. He named a few suspects, including a trusted senior officer, Lieutenant Laura, who had been with Alina from the very beginning. Suspicion lingered, and Alina knew she had to make a choice. She couldn't ignore this. A mole could destroy everything they had worked for, and the Vorith would find their way in through any crack they could exploit. Yet, even as Alina mulled over the options, a lingering doubt gnawed at her. Was Ivan simply trying to manipulate her? Was it possible that he was the one who was compromised? Late that night, Alina decided to investigate further. She followed Ivan's lead and confronted Lieutenant Lyra in private. Lyra's face betrayed nothing. She stood tall, her eyes unwavering, and when Alina asked her about the supposed betrayal, she reacted with a calmness that only deepened the suspicion. She denied everything, insisting that the accusations were nothing more than paranoia, that the Vorith were using their fear against them. Alina, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She turned her back to Lyra, pretending to leave, but then, in the split second of quiet before the door closed, she heard the faintest sound, the faintest whisper, coming from the shadows. Alina spun around, but it was too late. Before she could react, Ivan stepped from the darkness, his expression cold, his gun drawn. He had been the traitor all along. The accusation had been a setup, a calculated move to eliminate Lyra, who had been loyal to the cause. Ivan had been working with the Vorith from the very beginning, feeding them information and watching the resistance tear itself apart from within. His betrayal was far deeper than anyone had suspected. With a single cruel smile, Ivan raised the gun. Alina's heart pounded in her chest. She had been too late. There was no time for second chances. As the sound of gunfire echoed in the narrow corridor, Alina's world came crashing down. In that moment, Alina understood the true cost of the war. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. The Vorith had not only invaded their planet, they had invaded their very hearts. The battle for Earth was no longer just a fight against invaders. It was a fight against the shadows within, where even the bravest could fall. The betrayal had shattered the resistance, and Alina knew that with each passing day, the fight for survival was slipping further from their grasp. But in that moment of crisis, something inside Alina hardened. She couldn't let this defeat define them. The resistance may have been fractured, but it wasn't broken. Ivan's betrayal had only fueled her resolve. She would rebuild, and they would fight back. The Vorith would never take humanity's spirit, not without a fight. Alina stood alone in the aftermath of the betrayal, her mind racing as the weight of Ivan's treachery hung over her. The resistance was in disarray. Trust had been shattered, and the remaining fighters were scattered, reeling from the loss of their closest allies. The Vorith, sensing the fracture in humanity's unity, pressed their advantage. Their attacks grew bolder, more relentless, and the planet seemed to be slipping further into despair. Yet, despite the overwhelming darkness, there was still a glimmer of hope. The Phoenix Project, the weapon buried deep beneath the Earth's surface, remained their final chance to turn the tide. It was a weapon capable of crippling the Vorith's mind control technology, something that could restore free will to the millions of humans under their sway. But Alina knew activating it would not be without consequences. The device was powerful, but it was also unpredictable. And with the Vorith closing in on the Resistance's last stronghold, there was no time to waste. Alina had made a decision. She would not let the Vorith win. They had taken so much already, but they would never take humanity's will to survive. The Phoenix Project had to be activated, no matter the cost. But she couldn't do it alone. The remaining members of the Resistance, those who had not fallen or been turned, had to be united once more. They needed to strike as one, or they would fall in pieces. In a quiet corner of the shattered city, Alina sent a message to the remaining leaders of the resistance cells, urging them to join forces and rally around the Phoenix Project. Time was running out, and she knew the Vorith would stop at nothing to ensure their domination. The rebellion's last hope lay in their unity. Across the globe, small pockets of resistance began to stir. Fighters who had once been scattered in isolation came together, their bonds strengthened by a shared purpose. Even those who had once doubted the feasibility of the Phoenix Project now saw it as the only path forward. The message of Alina's unwavering resolve spread like wildfire, reigniting the fire of rebellion in the hearts of the oppressed. But just as hope began to rise, the Vorith made their move. They launched a full-scale assault on the last human stronghold. Their mind-controlled forces, bolstered by the relentless alien war machines, descended upon the city like a storm. The resistance was outnumbered, and every inch of ground was fiercely contested, but the rebellion was not going to go down without a fight. Each soldier, each civilian, fought with the ferocity of someone who had nothing left to lose. In the chaos of battle, Alina led the charge toward the Phoenix Project's activation chamber. It was located in a remote, heavily fortified underground bunker, buried deep beneath the Earth's crust. The resistance fought valiantly, holding off the Vorith forces long enough to allow Alina and her most trusted officers to reach the chamber. But even as they reached the control center, Alina's heart sank. The Vorith were already there. They had anticipated the resistance's move and had set a trap. The chamber was surrounded, and a Vorith fleet hovered just outside, waiting for the final moment to crush any hope of humanity's survival. Alina's mind raced. There was no more time for tactics, no more time for hesitation. The Phoenix Project had to be activated, now, or all would be lost. With a grim resolve, she made the ultimate sacrifice. Alina knew that the weapon's activation would not just affect the Vorith. It would send a pulse of energy so powerful it could destabilize the entire planet. The cost of victory was steep, but there was no turning back. As the countdown began, Alina made a final plea to her comrades, urging them to survive and carry on the fight. Then, with a steady hand, she pressed the button that would set the Phoenix Project into motion. The ground trembled, and the sky above the battlefield seemed to crack open. A blinding flash of light erupted from the chamber, cascading outward in waves of pure energy. The Vorith's forces faltered, their mind control systems short-circuiting, their war machines grinding to a halt. The pulse spread across the globe, disrupting the Vorith's hold on humanity. For the first time in years, humanity could think for itself. The Vorith were no longer in control. But the price of victory was clear. The Earth shuddered under the weight of the weapon's power, and the resistance, what remained of it, could only watch as the world around them was torn apart. Alina's final words echoed in the minds of those who survived. "This is our last hope. Let us rise again." The world trembled, but humanity did not fall. The pulse from the Phoenix Project had shattered the Vorith's mind control and crippled their technological dominance, giving people the chance to think for themselves again. For the first time in years, humans could feel their own willpower surging back, a wave of defiance sweeping across the globe. But the cost of this freedom was steep, and the planet's fragile stability had been pushed to the brink. As the aftershock of the Phoenix Project spread, the Vorith were reeling, their forces in disarray. Their mind-controlled soldiers, once unyielding, were now confused and scattered, vulnerable to the rebellion's renewed efforts. Yet, the victory was far from complete. The Vorith were ruthless, and even without their mind control, they were not easily defeated. The alien invaders began to regroup, sending their remaining forces to reclaim lost ground and crush the resistance once and for all. But Alina had already anticipated this. She had given everything to ensure humanity's survival, and now it was up to the survivors to carry on her legacy. The rebellion had been given a chance to strike back, and they could not waste it. The resistance cells, once fractured and divided, united under a single banner: freedom. The streets of the world's cities were transformed into battlegrounds. In Paris, the resistance fought side by side with civilians who had once been enslaved by the Vorith. In Berlin, former soldiers who had once fallen under the Vorith's control now fought for their survival, remembering what it meant to be human. Across the globe, the war was reigniting, but this time it was different. The fear that had once crippled humanity was replaced by an unshakable resolve. Amidst the chaos, a new leader emerged from the ashes of Alina's sacrifice: Captain Eric Graves, a former member of the elite human military forces. Eric had fought alongside Alina and Mark during the early days of the war, and his bravery had earned him the respect of the scattered resistance groups. He had witnessed the destruction of his comrades, the heartbreak of betrayal, and the unyielding will of humanity. Now, with Alina's passing, it was his turn to lead. Eric rallied the resistance with a message that spread across the airwaves. We will not bow to them. Not now, not ever. The Vorith may have broken our bodies, but they will never break our spirits. This is the final stand. Let them see the power of humanity's defiance. The world responded. Every continent, every city, every corner of the earth seemed to shake with the cry of defiance. The Vorith, disoriented and outnumbered, had underestimated humanity's ability to rise from the ashes. The rebel forces fought fiercely, pushing back the Vorith's remaining footholds one by one. Even the mind-controlled soldiers, once unstoppable, were now being freed by the Resistance's tactics, their programming broken, their will returned. The final confrontation was set. In the heart of what was once the Vorith's central command, a massive fortress was built, an impenetrable bastion from which they had ruled over Earth. Eric knew that if they were to win, they had to take the fight directly to them. The Vorith were no longer just invaders, they were a force of tyranny that had to be eradicated. As Eric and his forces stormed the gates of the Vorith stronghold, they were met with resistance, but it was no longer the overwhelming force of the past. The Vorith were desperate, their weapons unreliable, their leaders disoriented. Humanity's defiance had ignited something greater than just rebellion. It had sparked a revolution. With every blast, every fallen Vorith soldier, the resistance grew stronger. In the end, it was not technology, nor strength, that would win the war. It was the human spirit, the same spirit that had refused to bend, that had fought through years of oppression and suffering. The Vorith had underestimated the power of that spirit, and now they were learning the hard way that they could never conquer the will of humanity. The battle raged on, but the spark of hope, once ignited, could not be extinguished. The resistance had proven that even in the darkest moments, humanity would rise, defy, and fight back against those who sought to crush them. The defiance of the brave would echo throughout the ages, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The battle for Earth had raged for years, but now, as the Vorith stronghold lay in ruins, the final echoes of war faded into a tense but hopeful silence. The once omnipresent alien forces were no longer a threat to humanity's freedom. The remaining Vorith had either been defeated or scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy, their grip on Earth shattered beyond repair. It was over. The cost had been astronomical, lives lost, cities destroyed, ecosystems ravaged, but the price had been worth it. Humanity had survived. In the aftermath of victory, the world began to rebuild. What remained of the resistance, now united under the banner of the new human leadership, worked tirelessly to heal the wounds left by years of war. Eric Graves, now a symbol of humanity's resilience, stood at the helm, guiding the fractured world toward a new future. The world was scarred, yes, but it was not broken. In every city, the remnants of the war could be seen: crumbled buildings, scorched earth, and the occasional relic of alien technology still lying in the streets, a stark reminder of the battle they had just won. But amidst the destruction, life was returning. The world's people, once subjugated and oppressed, now stood united, their spirits unbroken. They were free, and they were determined to rebuild their societies, stronger than before. Eric stood in what had once been the heart of the Vorith-controlled territory, now a thriving center for the new human government. Around him, leaders from all parts of the world, former resistance fighters, scientists, civilians, gathered to begin the long process of restoration. Earth's technology, once corrupted by the Vorith, was being reclaimed, and the Phoenix Project, which had sparked humanity's resurgence, was now being adapted to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. "We've fought and bled for this moment," Eric said to the gathered assembly, "but this is only the beginning. We are not simply rebuilding what was broken, we are forging something new, something better. We are not just humans surviving, we are humans thriving." The crowd cheered, the weight of the last years finally lifting from their shoulders. It was a moment of unity that had been unimaginable just months before. The war had not only united humanity in resistance against the Vorith, but it had awakened a deep sense of solidarity and purpose. People who had once been divided by borders, by politics, by ideologies, now stood together with a singular goal: to ensure that Earth, their home, would never again fall under the shadow of invaders. Meanwhile, the planet itself began to recover. Nature, which had been pushed to the brink of collapse under Vorith occupation, slowly started to heal. The skies cleared as the planet's environment, poisoned by alien toxins, began to restore itself. Crops were replanted, forests regrew, and the oceans started to reclaim their purity. There were still challenges ahead, but the Earth was no longer a dying world. It was a world on the verge of rebirth. The surviving humans understood the importance of this new chapter. They had seen what tyranny could do, how quickly it could snuff out freedom, but they had also seen the power of their unity, the strength of their defiance. They had proven that even in the darkest times, the human spirit could endure, could rise, could rebuild. As Eric gazed out over the assembly, his mind turned to Elena, to Mark, to all those who had fallen. They had given their lives for this future, and though they were no longer here to witness it, their sacrifices would not be forgotten. Humanity had risen from the ashes, and now, the dawn of a new era was beginning, a world where the lessons of the past would shape a brighter, freer future. This was only the beginning. A new era had begun, not just for Earth, but for all of humanity. And it would not be defined by conquest, but by the unyielding will to protect the freedom that had cost so much to achieve. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: humanity would never again be afraid.